Well, what we will do in this demonstration is to look at yet another way of drawing, a group of trees or distant wooded area. So essentially, I showed how to draw a group of trees in the distance in this demonstration where we drew this. So this is a nice, simple landscape that you can draw by drawing, the different trees, and then you show their distance by making the, trees in the distance smaller and, hidden behind the foliage of the trees in the foreground. So this was a nice, simple, demonstration that I earlier did. And then I also showed how you can draw this kind of, wooded area. So this is a different approach where we did not draw. So essentially, when you look at the other one, here we have a distinct tree shapes, and then we have a sense of distance with the trees receding. But in this approach, what we did was to simply kind of create a foliage of a group of trees, that kind of blend into each other, and then we drew the kind of the tree trunks. So this was a different approach, but in essentially again, my aim in over here is to show you different ways in which you can draw nice simple landscapes. So essentially, there are a lot of different techniques that you can use, and the feel is different. So over here you have a feel for a different feel compared to over here. So essentially, we are looking at different ways of doing these different wooded areas and how you can draw a simple landscape. And what I will show in this demonstration is yet another way in which you can draw a kind of feel for a wooded area. And what we will do in this demonstration is to draw something like this. So this is yet another approach. So what happens over here is that even compared to last two approaches, you're even having a more indistinct feel for the trees. So essentially here we make it even more kind of far out, and we give it even less of a hint of tree foliage over here. So essentially, when you're drawing any landscape, you decide how much detail you want to show in terms of having a distinct shape for the tree. And this is yet another approach where we, even have a very faint, distinct outline, just the bare outline of the tree to create a nice feel for the wooded area. So we will see, how you can draw this simple landscape in these demonstrations. So essentially what we do in this approach is essentially, we put down this line that defines, our plane, where we will have, the wooded areas from. And what we do is simply start to, add parallel lines over here. So this is essentially, this technique is all about using parallel lines to kind of, give a hint of shape of trees. So that's what we are doing. Essentially, I simply just start to add parallel lines. So this is very similar to how you draw distant foliage. So in a lot of demonstration, we saw that, you use parallel lines in the distance to draw, kind of distant foliage, right? So essentially, this is something that, we have seen a lot of demonstrations. What we are doing over here is to essentially use the same technique, but we will be adding a bit more contrast, the darks to this shape to essentially bring out a sense of wooded area. So that's what we will do. So essentially the first step is to essentially draw, just create these lines and kind of have first layer of parallel lines. The one thing to notice is that here, the size is much bigger than what we have used normally in a distant foliage. So essentially in a distant foliage, as the name implies, that foliage is at a distance. So you have to draw the distant foliage, small. So if I had, a ground line, then, my distant foliage was usually kind of, very small. So essentially, with the distance, things become smaller. And when we do the distant foliage, we usually draw something like this over here, something like this. This is much smaller. But what we are doing over here is to essentially use the same technique, but we are going to indicate a kind of wooded area that is not too far, using these lines. So I have to make them a bit bigger. And what we do next is to essentially, use the same lines to bring out the shape of a kind of shape of the tree in here. So essentially, if you want, you can put down the dotted line, but essentially, yeah, so this is kind of a trunk. But what you will do is to use the same parallel lines to add more kind of contrast, more texture to these this space. So I just put down this dotted line for the trunk, and then what I do is, again, I use the same line over here, and then when I go around here, so there will be some kind of foliage, and then I again add something like this over here. So this is what I start to do over here. Simply I add a bit more over here, a bit of trunk over here, and then a bit more over here. So essentially over here, you're just using these parallel lines and just adding a bit more texture to essentially kind of define the shape of trees over here. So something like this. So here again, I draw a bit of trunk shape and then just add some kind of foliage shape over here. And it doesn't have to be uniform, again, you can add a bit more dark here, a bit more dark over here. But the aim again is to kind of essentially use these parallel lines And we are doing the same over here that we did in some other demonstration where we did not kind of draw the distinct tree foliage shape. So essentially I'm not drawing individual distinct trees, but what I'm doing is essentially defining a trunk here and then just adding some kind of foliage over here, something like this. So this is yet another approach, and where we have this kind of backdrop of parallel lines to kind of give it a nice feel. So this is getting a sense of wooded area, because these parallel lines in the back is giving a sense of kind of woods. So why we add a bit more some more texture to bring out some sense of trees as well. So essentially when you draw a distant foliage with using these lines, you just leave it like this. So essentially in a distance you just leave it like this, and if you want you can darken the base, but essentially you do not have any indication of distinct tree shapes in this distant foliage. So we use the same technique, but now what we are doing is you're bringing it closer to the viewer. And when you bring this kind of distant foliage closer to the viewer, now what you are showing also is some kind of tree shapes within the that foliage. So now that is giving a sense of woods, because now there is more of a shape of tree presence. So this is essentially how you do it. Essentially you kind of use the parallel lines, and depending on how much shape, how much closer you want to bring them to the viewer, and how much of wooded feel you want to give them, you just add a bit of the shapes that again indicate some kind of tree presence in there. And the other cool thing that I like to do is to again make the base a bit darker. So essentially in another demonstration we use the kind of bush, right? We just do a base of a bush closer to the ground, behind which the trunks were hidden. So I just like it because it gives a better feel overall in the end. So that's what we will do. We'll add a bit of darkness to the base, something like this. So again I'm making a bit of jagged kind of darkness over here. So I'm kind of I'm just adding a bit of darkness, something like this over here. So this will kind of again serve as a kind of silhouette of the bush at the base. So essentially the technique is same that we saw in other demonstration, but here we are just using the parallel lines for drawing all that. So we are just using the parallel lines for even drawing the trunk and also drawing this base. So essentially this is a different feel that we have in our drawing. So this is kind of giving a bit of hazy feel, if you can think of it as that, right? So I just added a bit of this darkness at the base, and that kind of gives a nice kind of base definition. And then if you want you can add a bit more trunks over here. So again just simply use this parallel lines, or just use a dot if you want, something like this, right? So add a bit more trunks, and if you want you can continue over here as well, right? So we'll just again add a bit of lines, parallel lines, to define some kind of tree foliage, and then we can continue our bush, and then again just use the parallel lines to again draw the trunk as well, something like this. So there you have it, right? And then a bit more. So this is a different technique again, so it's always good to try different techniques, and you might like some more than the other, but this is a different technique where you again give a sense of distant trees, and this is all using parallel lines. So what we did was to simply start with the broad parallel line set. So this broad it gives us a nice backdrop. So this essentially creates a backdrop, and these lines they extend, and this is essentially conveying to our mind that there is something more in the back. So that's what we did with the other demonstration. I used the parallel lines to indicate a more tree line in the back, and what we are doing over here is to create this first layer of parallel lines that serves the stage for us to add more lines to create this kind of foliage mass over here. And then we use the same parallel lines or dots or something like that to indicate the trunk. So something like this. And then if you want you can add a bit more darkness again, so if you want you can always add a bit of local darkness that brings out that has more contrast, and sometimes makes the drawing more impactful. So you can add a bit of darkness at the base again, add more darks where the trunk and the foliage meets in some spot over here, and a little bit over here, in somewhere here, a little bit here, a little bit there. So again the whole technique is to practice and reach a stage where you can make it non-uniform and make it more kind of believable. So initially when you will draw it, you might find yourself kind of having a pattern in it, and that will not look believable. But now once with practice, what happens is now I can just add bit over here, bit over there, and this starts to kind of get a sense of trees. So over there, so bit over here, bit over there, darken the bottom, bit here. So again I just keep moving my pen, a bit here, bit there, something like this. So you're playing with it, you're bringing out that feel for wood in here, right? And if you want, add a bit more trunk over here, something over here, add more trunks if you want more feel for the wooded, something like that, right? And then again add darkness. So this is a different approach to drawing a kind of wooded trees not too far in the distance. But again, this result, the end result is a bit of hazy feel because the distinct outline of tree is not present. But again, this is a different feel, but I mean, I like it, right? So there are different ways in which you can try drawing these distant wooded areas. And finally, what you can do is to again have a bit of ground definition that we saw in other demonstrations as well. So this is a bit of white spot. If you want, you can add a water reflection, that we have seen in other demonstrations, how to add reflection. Or for this tutorial, I'll just simply add a bit of ground lines. So we have seen how to add these ground lines and then essentially draw kind of ground cover, a kind of grass ground cover on them to kind of have a definition of ground. And also what I'm doing is to leave these whites, right? So essentially when you define the ground form, just create a path that the eyes can travel towards that wood. That's what I do. I just simply create these ground lines and then just essentially draw some kind of a ground cover on them to give it a bit more polished, finished feel to our drawing. Something like this, and then in the end what you can do is essentially add this kind of grass cover, something like this. So this kind of grass cover gives a nice feel to the ground. So that's what I will do, just add a bit more. So here you can see just by adding a bit of ground line and then adding a bit of grass, just using like this, a bit here, a bit there, it gives a bit more solid definition to the ground. And now this white is a kind of seen as a worn out path that our eyes can travel. So this also becomes a conduit for our eyes to kind of travel the path and connect more with the drawings. So I'll just add a bit more of these grasses to this ground form, and there we have it, right? So this is something like this. And there's a lot of other things you can do with this composition. If you want, you can even draw a tree which is more closer to the viewer. So again, my aim with all this demonstration is to show different ways in which you can approach a landscape. But then in terms of adding other elements and making some changes, that's something that you should always experiment with. So here you can add a bit more close-up tree, or if you want you can even have a small kind of outcrop or what have you, right? So there are a lot of possibilities in terms of adding different elements that we have seen in other demonstrations. But what I try to do in my demonstration is essentially bring out the core aspect of the nature of that that landscape that we are drawing. So over here what we did is essentially start by use these long parallel lines to create a kind of background, and then we use same parallel lines to essentially create a kind of definition of the foliage, and then we use the same lines to essentially even draw trunks and kind of darkness at the base to indicate kind of bush or some kind of old growth near the floor. So this kind of together, this serves a nice indication of a kind of a wooded area that is not too far. So this is something that you can feel, because you can see those some shapes of the tree foliage, like this clump. So it's essentially this is a nice, very nice drawing, because it gives a sense of distance, but it's not too far, and it's something that is very easy to do because you just simply use parallel lines, add more here and there, just to create the texture and feel for these trees over there. And then finally, let me just finish with the grass. And there we have it, right? So this is a nice simple drawing that gives a nice feel for a wooded area close by, not too far in the distance, and it's something that you can easily do anytime, and yeah, do it in under 10 minutes. Thanks, take care, bye bye.